Was Martin Luther King a conservative? Now, here we have to make a distinction between conservative and Republican. I'm not saying that Martin Luther King was a Republican. He wasn't, but neither was he a Democrat. He was unaffiliated with both parties. I'm going to make the argument, however, that Martin Luther King was, in the very core meaning of the term, conservative. Let me start with the issue of whether he was a Republican. Now, Martin Luther King explicitly distanced himself from both parties. Here's a quote. I am not inextricably bound to either party. He never fully identified with either one. Now, he was pretty good friends with Nixon. I believe he voted for Kennedy in the '60 campaign. He certainly voted for LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, in '64. And he made some very nasty comments about Barry Goldwater. The reason for this is that Barry Goldwater had opposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, I think what makes this very tragic is Barry Goldwater was a libertarian. He opposed the act on libertarian grounds. He was not a racist. In fact, he was one of the co-founders of the Phoenix NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He had helped to integrate the National Guard and the public schools in Arizona. But because Goldwater opposed the Civil Rights Act on libertarian grounds, he didn't think the government should be allowed to restrict private discrimination. Yes, the government could impose equal rights under the law on government functions, but the invasion into the private sector, he thought that was going too far. That was not the province of government. So King slanders him, I think, unfairly. And that's why many people think, here's smoking gun proof the King was never a Republican. Well, it's proof that he wasn't ever a Goldwater Republican. But King was also very well aware of something that the left today tries to conceal, that the racist Dixiecrats, the people blocking the Civil Rights Act, were overwhelmingly, in fact, were all, in the Democratic Party. Later, one or two moved into the Republican Party, Strom Thurmond and one guy in the House. But the vast majority of Dixiecrats all stayed in the Democratic Party. They died as Democrats. They're lionized to this day. There are buildings named after them in Washington, D.C. King knew all this. He wasn't, in that sense, he didn't deceive the public and he didn't deceive himself. Now, what about the idea of King being a conservative? You can't answer this question without asking a simple question. Who is a conservative? What is a conservative in the American context? People abuse this word conservative, and they sometimes apply it, and I'd call it an operational sense. So conservatives are against change. No. Was Trump against change? No. Conservatives want to change things. I want to change. If it were up to me, I would change the tax code. I would change the size of government. I would change U.S. commitments abroad. There are lots of things I'd change. So my conservatism has nothing to do with opposing change. Yeah, Dinesh, the segregationists were all conservatives because they oppose change. First of all, this is just a meaningless statement. Segregation itself developed after the Civil War. It became entrenched in the 1890s. It's not something that goes back to time immemorial. The segregation laws in the South were enacted by Democratic legislatures, Democratic governors, and so on. And yes, the segregationists wanted to keep those laws, but that doesn't make them conservative in any meaningful sense of the word. So here's what conservatism in America today means. It's conserving the principles of the American Revolution. Conserving the principles of the American Revolution. Now, the American Revolution was, in a sense, a classically liberal revolution. One could argue that revolutions, by definition, can't be conservative because they bring about a dramatic upheaval, a turning of the tables, a new order. The American Revolution did all that. But nevertheless, that's a revolution we want, we can live with, and we're trying to preserve the principles of that revolution today. Now, Martin Luther King, in his most famous speech, I Have a Dream, said the following: I am submitting a promissory note, and I am demanding that it be cashed. Right away raising the question, what note? Who wrote the note? Did the Southern segregationists unwittingly give him some sort of note that he could then cash? No. So what was Martin Luther King talking about? Well, he was talking about the Declaration of Independence. He was talking about the Charter of American Liberty, the document that, in a sense, is the guiding spirit of the Constitution. All men are created equal. Now, here's the great irony. That document was penned by Thomas Jefferson, a Virginia planter who on his Monticello plantation had over 200 slaves. So think about it. Martin Luther King, in demanding freedom, is cashing a check, to use his own terms, that was written by a Southern slave owner. And this, I think, captures in a little glimpse, in a little kaleidoscopic glimpse, the complexity of American history, which is that Jefferson's principles were better than he was. He was able to articulate a principle of freedom, even though he fell short, woefully short, in practicing that principle. So when I say conservatism is about conserving the principles of the founding, we're talking about the principles of the founding, not the practices of the founders. And so King knew that. He made that distinction in his mind. He recognized, I don't have to embrace Jefferson's plantation habits. The way, for example, that he related to the slaves, whether or not he had a relationship with Sally Hemings, all that is to the side. The real issue is that it was this principle, and how strange it is that a slave owner would articulate such a principle that he knew stood against everything that his own life represented. But I think Jefferson wanted America to be a better place, to become a better place than it was. And King understood that. And so Lincoln understood that also. So one can see in a way the civil rights movement, but also the Civil War, as two massive attempts, successful attempts, to cash in on the principles introduced by Jefferson at the outset. Martin Luther King did not look to a progressive future that was untethered to the past. He wasn't trying to move away from the founding. He was trying to move toward the founding. He was trying to recapture, and you may say revivify, re-energize, apply today the founding principle that Lincoln called a principle for all men at all times, the principle of the Declaration of Independence.